I stood in the sterile chill of the ICU, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator a cruel counterpoint to the frantic beating of my heart. My wife, Adeline, lay motionless, tethered to machines, her life hanging by a thread. I'd called our daughter, Eloise, desperate for her to come, to offer comfort, to simply me there. Her response, delivered with an icy indifference that still echoes in my memory, was, "I'm busy. Don't make a big deal out of it." Just 5 words. 5 words that shattered my world more profoundly than any accident ever could. "All right," I managed to say, the word tasting like ash. In that moment I knew. My daughter had betrayed me. The next morning I severed every tie, signed a single document, and watched as her name became a ghost in my life. 42 missed calls followed, each one a desperate plea I refused to answer. The smell of hospital disinfectant, usually a symbol of cleanliness, hung heavy in the Charlotte General ICU that night. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like the slow, agonizing end of my 40-year marriage. I, Vance Sinclair, a 65-year-old retired bridge inspector, sat numbly, my eyes fixed on the double doors where they had taken Adeline. For 4 decades, my job was to find the rust in the steel, the rot in the concrete, to prevent collapse. But I never once thought to shine that same critical light on the foundation of my own home. My hands, usually so capable, felt like lead in my lap, heavy and useless. Adeline had been driving down Highway 74, a route we'd taken 1,000 times, when the brakes on her sedan simply vanished. The doctors called it a miracle she was alive, but as the ventilator hissed, I felt only a crushing, hollow guilt. It should have been me in that car. I should have noticed the squeal of the pads, felt the softness in the pedal. Instead, I was at the hardware store buying mulch, while my wife careened towards a concrete pylon. It was a structural failure I should have predicted, but even more disturbing than the mechanical collapse was the deafening silence from my own blood. I looked at my phone again. No missed calls, no texts. Eloise Sinclair Madden, our 34-year-old daughter, who ran a high-end design firm and always had her phone glued to her palm, was missing in action. She was choosing to stay away, while her mother's chest was being cracked open by a surgical team. Have you ever felt a bridge give way beneath your feet? It's not the falling that kills you. It's the realization that what you trusted to be solid was actually made of dust. I hit the call button for the 4th time, my thumb trembling. This time, the line clicked open. There was no warmth, no frantic questions about her mother's vitals, just the faint sound of a distant party and a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Dad, I told you I'm exhausted," she said, her voice like a sheet of ice. "I'm in the middle of something important, and I really don't need the drama right now. I'll check in tomorrow if I have time. Good night." Before I could tell her that Adeline might not see the sunrise, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, a cold lump of betrayal forming in my gut that no doctor could cut out. Nurse Joyce, a woman with weary eyes and a soft voice that suggested she had delivered too much bad news in her 40 years of service, approached me with a clipboard. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we need to process the $15,000 surgical deposit for the neuro rehab transfer." I nodded, reaching for my wallet. I pulled out my primary credit card, the one I had used for every major purchase for 20 years. "Declined." A simple word on a tiny screen. It wasn't just a card, it was my entire life's safety net. I tried my backup card with a forced smile. "Declined." "That's impossible," I told her, my voice cracking. "There's over 50,000 in that line of credit alone." I looked at the nurse's pitying face and then down at my phone. If my credit was gone, where was the $300,000 I had set aside for our retirement? The buzzing in my ears drowned out the hospital intercom, a high-pitched whine that sounded exactly like the sirens I'd heard screaming down Highway 74 just 6 hours ago. I fumbled with my phone, my thumb slipping against the glass as I tried to log into my bank app while Nurse Joyce watched me with a pained, patient expression. The $300,000 retirement fund should have been there, a solid bedrock I'd spent 40 years pouring into our future. But the screen just kept spinning, mocking my desperation. My mind began to fracture, slipping backward through the timeline to the moment the foundation first cracked. I was sitting in my home office, putting the finishing touches on a safety report for the Catawba River Bridge, when the phone rang. "Mr. Sinclair." It was a voice from the Highway Patrol, flat and professional. "There has been an accident. Highway 74 near the overpass." The officer described a horrific single-vehicle crash involving a silver sedan. I remember the air leaving my lungs. "Is she alive?" I had gasped, the room spinning, as the life I knew began to cave in. They told me she was being airlifted, mentioning a probable brake failure that had sent her through the guardrail. Memory is a funny thing. It doesn't come back as a story. It comes back as the smell of burning rubber and the taste of copper in the back of your throat. I recall the drive to the hospital, passing the crash site under the strobe of emergency lights. As a bridge inspector, I am trained to see the structural truth behind a collapse. I slowed just enough to see the debris field and the skid marks, or rather, the lack of them. The steel shouldn't have twisted like that if she'd had any chance to slow down. Something felt wrong, a jagged edge in the narrative of a mechanical fluke. I'd given Eloise $2,000 in cash just last Tuesday. I told her the brakes were squealing and asked her to take the car to her preferred mechanic while I was out on a site visit. She'd called me that evening, her voice airy and confident, telling me it was all taken care of. New pads, new rotors, good as new. But the evidence on the asphalt suggested the pads had been non-existent. Do you know what it's like to realize you've been handing a wolf the keys to your sheepfold? The realization doesn't hit you all at once. It bleeds in. When I finally burst into the ER, I saw Adeline Sinclair, 63, lying beneath the pale blue hospital sheets. She was a retired librarian who always believed life followed a fair Dewey Decimal System. But now, her life was being measured in the erratic peaks of a heart monitor. Dr. Leandros, a neurosurgeon with a face as sharp and precise as the scalpels he carried, stepped out of the trauma bay with blood on his scrubs. "She has a massive subdural hematoma, Vance. We're going in now." I stood there, paralyzed, as the orderlies began to wheel her toward the elevators. I reached out, grabbing her bag to keep it safe, and her phone vibrated inside the side pocket. I pulled it out, my eyes blurring, as I saw a message from Eloise, sent an hour before the crash. "Don't worry about the car, Mom. It's safe now." I stared at that text. It's safe now. As the elevator doors hissed shut on my wife. Safe or silenced. My hands started to shake, and it wasn't from the cold hospital air. Grief is supposed to be heavy, but betrayal is cold. So cold it makes your teeth ache, in a room that's already freezing. I stood in the ICU hallway, clutching Adeline's phone, as if it were the only tether I had left to the woman who was currently being stitched back together behind heavy steel doors. The next few hours were a blur of medical jargon, hushed conversations, and the constant, agonizing wait. But the truth, like a structural flaw, was slowly revealing itself. The bank accounts, the credit cards, the retirement fund, all drained. Every penny, gone. And then, the final, most heinous discovery. Eloise had tried to sign a comfort care-only waiver for Adeline 48 hours ago. If the hospital hadn't flagged the pending insurance dispute, she would have effectively stopped all life-saving treatment while I was at the hardware store. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was lethal. The night nurse, a man named Marcus, with soft-soled shoes and a quiet efficiency that respected the gravity of the room, moved around the bed like a shadow. He checked the IV bag, the smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile plastic following him. I looked up and handed him the forms. "I need to remove my daughter from all medical decision-making roles," I said, my voice as flat and hard as a granite slab. "Effective immediately." Marcus took the clipboard, his eyes reflecting a weary understanding. "I'll get the social worker to notarize the change at shift change, Mr. Sinclair." I watched him leave, then picked up my black pen. Delete. A 6-letter word that carries more weight than 1,000 apologies. One click, and 34 years of history became an empty folder. I struck through Eloise's name on every document, the ink bleeding into the paper like a final judgment. I listed Basil Redmond, my trusted attorney, as the primary contact. feeling a literal weight lift from my chest as the legal tether to my daughter was severed. I opened my laptop, the blue light stinging my eyes. I began the digital exile, changing every password and removing Eloise from every shared account. I found a photo of her as my wallpaper, a picture from her graduation where she looked so bright and promising. With a steady thumb, I selected delete. Pruning a family tree is messy work. You end up with sap on your hands and a hole where a branch used to be, but it is the only way to save the trunk. You are not a Sinclair anymore, I muttered to the empty air. You are just a case number. As I finished the final purge, I found an old handwritten emergency plan in Adeline's purse that she'd written years ago. Her shaky script from 3 years ago stated clearly that she never wanted Eloise to have control over her care. I looked at the note and realized I wasn't the only one she had been hiding things from. She knew. And as the sun began to rise over Charlotte, the hospital doors opened for my attorney with news of the arraignment. The oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a groan that sounded like a bridge cable snapping under too much tension, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't there to fix the break. I walked into the gallery, adjusting my tie with fingers that felt like cold iron. I had spent the night purging my daughter from every digital and legal corner of my life, but the physical reality of the courtroom was a different kind of audit. I took my seat in the front row, my back as straight as a support beam. A moment later, Eloise was led in through a side door. The designer poise I had seen her wear like armor only days ago was gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hair was a bird's nest, and her eyes were wild as she scanned the room. When she locked eyes with me, she immediately attempted a look of tearful innocence, her lip trembling in that rehearsed way she'd used since she was 6. I met her gaze with the clinical, unblinking focus of a bridge inspector assessing a condemned structure. I offered no comfort, no recognition. "Daddy, please," she mouthed the words, silent behind the glass partition. I whispered to the empty seat beside me, where Adeline should have been sitting. "The inspection is over." Judge Miller, a man with silver hair and a reputation for being as unyielding as the granite of the courthouse steps, looked down from the bench with zero patience for theatricality. Prosecutor Rachel, a woman who carried her case files like a loaded weapon, stood ready to dismantle the Sinclair Madden defense. She began reading the 7 felony counts, her voice echoing in the deathly silent room. The details of the fraudulent transition plan and the canceled brake repairs spilled out into the public record like toxic waste. Guilty. Not the verdict, but the weight of the air in the room. You could smell it on her. Stale fear and expensive perfume. Eloise's defense attorney tried to argue for a personal recognizance bond, citing her status in the community, but the floor fell out from under them mid-hearing. The attorney asked to be recused, stating that the retainers had been paid with stolen funds that the state had already clawed back. Is it possible to feel sorry for a wolf that finally got caught in the trap it set for its own pack? I looked for that pity in my chest and found only an empty, echoing hallway. Judge Miller leaned forward, his gaze piercing. The state requests a high bond, and this court agrees. Bail is set at $750,000, cash or surety. The irony hit the room like a physical blow. It was the precise value of Adeline's life insurance policy. Eloise collapsed into her seat, her face a mask of shattered glass. "I don't have that. Dad, tell them," she shrieked as the bailiffs moved in. I didn't wait for the gavel to hit the sound block. I stood up and turned my back on the woman I used to call my daughter, walking toward the exit while she was still being led away to a cell she couldn't buy her way out of. As I stepped past the heavy oak doors and into the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from Jennifer, my lawyer, but it was a text from Nurse Joyce. "Adeline is awake. She's asking for Eloise." My world tilted on its axis. I burst through the ICU doors, still smelling of the courthouse's stale coffee and cold justice, only to find the one thing I wasn't prepared for, the light finally returning to Adeline's eyes. My journey back to Adeline was a slow, deliberate reconstruction. We spent weeks in therapy, not just for her physical recovery, but for the emotional scaffolding of our lives. Basil Redmond, my attorney, became a quiet, steady presence, handling the legal fallout, ensuring that justice, however painful, was served. Eloise's calls from the correctional facility became a daily nuisance, a persistent, irritating buzz I learned to ignore. She tried every angle, every plea, but the connection was severed. The bridge was burned. One crisp December afternoon, just before Christmas, I saw a car idling in our driveway. It wasn't a ghost or a threat, but Basil Redmond. He left a package on the porch, a framed photo of the original bridge blueprints I drew 40 years ago. It was a return to my true self, a reminder that I was built to create things that lasted, not just to watch them fall. I walked back inside and joined Adeline on the back deck. We sat in cedar Adirondack chairs, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, watching the first frost settle on the yard. We looked out over the area, where the new greenhouse would soon stand, discussing the quietude of our reclaimed life. I realized that the most resilient bridges aren't the ones that never crack, but the ones that are rebuilt with better materials after a total collapse. "We survived the stress test, Addie," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "The load is finally gone." She squeezed my fingers, looking up at the sky. "I don't think I've ever seen the stars look this sharp, Vance. Or maybe I'm just finally looking up instead of at my feet." 0. That's the amount of leverage she has left. A perfect, beautiful circle of nothing. At 11:45 p.m., my phone vibrated in my pocket, a final automated notification of a rejected call from the correctional facility. It was the last ghost of the year trying to find a way back into the house. I looked at the screen, seeing the familiar sequence of numbers, and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no pity, just the clinical observation of a dead signal. "Still calling, even at the end of the world," I remarked. Adeline didn't even look over. "Let it ring out into the cold, Vance. There is no one here to pick up anymore. Time is the ultimate inspector. It wears down the weak and polishes the strong, until only the truth is left standing in the morning light." The clock struck midnight in the distance, signaled by a few stray fireworks from the neighbors that blossomed like fireflowers over the tree line. I took my phone, navigated to the settings, and permanently deactivated the line associated with the jail calls, effectively cutting the last digital wire. I found a final unread text from Beckett Madden, Eloise's ex-husband, sent from his processing center. "She never deserved you." I deleted it without a second thought. Silence was the only power I needed now. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and we shared a quiet toast, looking toward the dark yard, where the library blueprints would soon become a reality in the spring sunshine. "Happy New Year, Addie. The audit is complete." "To the new year, Vance," she replied, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "To a house that finally stands on its own." I slid the phone into my pocket, the screen dark, and the connection severed forever. I looked at Adeline, took her hand, and walked back into the house, closing the door on the past with the steady, certain click of a lock that was finally truly secure. Looking back at this family story, I see my greatest failure wasn't missing the forged signatures, it was ignoring the early cracks in my own home. I spent decades inspecting bridges, but I refused to inspect character. This family story taught me that love without accountability becomes blindness. Don't be like me. Don't confuse silence with peace, or generosity with good parenting. When the warning signs appear, document them, address them. Truth may hurt, but denial destroys. Many people call what I did dad revenge. But if I'm honest, dad revenge was never about punishment. It was about protection. It was the moment I stopped being naive and started being responsible. Still, I regret that it had to come to that. In this family story, I learned that boundaries are not cruelty, they are structure. And real dad revenge is simply choosing justice over fear. Even so, no father dreams of standing in court against his own child. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Integrity must be audited, just like finances. Trust but verify. And when everything collapsed, I believe God allowed the exposure not to destroy us, but to rebuild us stronger. Faith didn't remove the storm. It steadied my hands while I rebuilt after the family story fell apart.